Okay. So Genesis 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout the generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep. Between me and you and your offspring after you, every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money, from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. But he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah. Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Uh, shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear with you at this time next year. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all those born in his house, or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day. And God said to him, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. Okay. Um. So I want to talk a little bit first, in kind of uh, broad view about conditional versus unconditional covenants, right? And I've mentioned before um, about how uh, I gave my rationale for why I thought it was pretty obvious. that the covenant that's in Genesis 15 is an unconditional covenant, and here is kind of the first um, conditional covenant. Now, um, I also talked about how um, so like this then brings into the question like how should we think about covenants, right? And I think what most people do, what most of the church does, is they lump all of these covenants together. And I don't think that that is entirely wrong, but I think the problem is that when you do that, people then start to treat it as if each um, iteration of the covenant is just a retelling of the same exact thing. And I sort of think that this is somewhat how a lot of the critical scholars too work with this too, right? And a lot of times they'll say like your JEDP document hypothesis people, they'll be like, oh, well, these are just two different accounts of the same covenant, and then they're both slapped in there in the story. And I I think that doesn't that also doesn't particularly make sense in this context because um, a, a lot of times whenever they say that that sort of thing is happening, they'll put both stories together, right? um, but here we have Genesis 16 in the middle of it, right? We have this whole Sarai Hagar thing that's going on, right? And so if you don't have that context, well, then the rest of the covenant doesn't really make sense. And I think the proper way to see this is what I talked about. Um, and I think it's recorded. We didn't record last week, so I don't fully remember where I spoke about it. But how I talked about that, I think a better idea is to think of the covenants as being layered on top of each other with all of them having the same ultimate goal, but that the covenants are utilized in different ways. And the best way to think about this is to think about how a family works, right? And how um, in your family you might have a set of rules, and those set of rules might have um, sticks or carrots, right? It might have punishments associated with it, and it might have um, rewards if you do follow it. But a lot of times underneath those is an understanding that, well, at the end of the day, we still have a relationship, and so we're still going to try and um, do some. There's still going to be an unconditional nature to our relationship. So even though on one level we have conditions to our relationship, at another level we still have this unconditional relationship, and those two things actually end up working together. um, and the other thing that I want to kind of talk about at a high level, and just to remind you guys of as we go through, is this idea that I talked about how um, symbols and the spiritualization process of a concept or of an idea or an action or of a thing, right? So like the spiritualization of the temple or whatever, right? The spiritualization process only works if there is um my argument is that it only works if there's an actualized step, right? That it is the actualized thing from which um we can understand uh the spiritual nature of it, right? and and why is this important? Because we're talking about this as Christians in a New Testament context, right? And we have this idea of like the circumcision of the heart, right? And I think that a lot of times whenever Christians hear about Paul talking about the circumcision of the heart, I feel like most of the time we just use it as a hand wavy way to be like, oh, this is why circumcision doesn't need to actually happen to Christians anymore, right? So he's, oh, because we're circumcised in the heart. It's like, oh, okay, well, what does that mean, right? And there's almost never any discussion about what the circumcision of the heart actually means. And if we want to understand what the circumcision of the heart means, it would probably help if we understand how actual circumcision worked and the function that circumcision served in the context of uh, God's covenant, right? Like if you don't understand that, you won't be able to spiritualize it to the circumcision of the heart later, right? Um uh Anything on those 2 points before we kind of get into it? I'm sure they'll come up again. All right, I'll just keep going. Um okay. So, uh I am God Almighty, right? So this is El Shaddai. Um so walk before me and be blameless. Okay. So, the conditions, so one of the first things that I want to kind of note about this covenant and why I think it's obvious that we shouldn't be lumping this covenant in with the covenant at Sinai, and we should be thinking about them as being distinct things, right? Is because walk before me and be blameless, in my opinion, actually like actually has more echoes backwards than it does forwards, right? Because this actually sounds a lot closer to like this is the only like moral condition, like action, that is established as a condition in this covenant. Walk before me and be blameless, right? Eh, we'll get to the actual circumcision part, but circumcision isn't a it's not a moral or ethical action, right? It's a physical identifier, and that we'll talk about in a little bit. But like the only actual action is just this one, and that's very different from the strict Sinai covenant that you can get later. It's actually much closer to this. If you do well, will you not be accepted, right? And so this is sort of one of the things that I want to highlight, because this is I think this is an example of that layeredness that I'm talking about, right? Um, so many people have this idea that the Bible is like a list of do's and don'ts and all that stuff, and where really, whenever you like the more base level that you get, we can see that um, I think it's God. It was always God's intention that um, the way in which we related to Him was um, in a basic and simple way, right? Um, at a fundamental level, which which might lead you to go, okay, well then why did it get crazy later? And the reason why it gets crazy later, I think, is because um the stipulations of the Sinai covenant are much more about, so I'm going to borrow Protestant words. I think they're much more about sanctification than they are salvation. And I know I don't know how much everybody's following the various internet uh, um, Christian internecine Christian wars that go on the internet currently. But yeah, I think the Sinai covenant is much more about a salvation or about a sanctification process than it is a salvation process. And usually the way that Protestants deal with this is, we'll say that salvation is a fundamentally, basically simple process. Sanctification is a complicated process, and I think that the covenants mirror that um, dynamic, I guess. Um, so let's talk about the name change a little bit. So, um, again, this is one of the things that I am upset about Step Bible, because the Step Bible used to be very good at giving you name meanings for the Hebrew and Greek right off the bat, and they now don't do that anymore. So I have to rely on AI and dig through it a little bit. But um, Abram to Abraham, um, the basic. So if we just go by, so Abram means exalted father, or I think a better way to think of it is just high father, and Abraham means the father of many nations. Um, and I want to compare that with the name change that's given to Sarai, right? And so it goes from Sarai to Sarah. Sarai is it's a much more subtle change, but it's a subtle change from something like my princess to something like just princess, right? So the basic change from Sarai to Sarah is that it loses the like personal possessive nature of the name, and it becomes and so by doing so, it becomes a more universal name, right? It's the difference between my dog and the dog, right? Like the dog is a much more generalized, universal concept versus my dog, and so it's the same kind of shift between um, like my princess and just princess, right? Um, and I think the last time that I talked about this, I claimed that both of them are um, fundamentally like an elevation up in their names, and I think actually what's going on is actually different from that. Um, Actually, I think what I want to argue is that Abram's name is actually a bit of a humbling. It's a bringing down, right? So it goes from high father to father of many nations, and so it becomes um, it's actually a bringing closer to earth, right? Um, Whereas Sarai goes from personal inner to universal, and so it does have that spreading out. And so I think you actually end up having a dynamic of Abraham's name bringing down and Sarai's name being brought up, and both of them together are spreading out into this larger um, family dynasty, kings, and all that stuff.
Well, you could also argue that it's a little bit to Abraham's chagrin that he is the father of many nations. 'Cause as I mentioned earlier, that he's like, oh, if only Ishmael could also be
Yes.
included, and God says no, like it's going to be a different nation sprouting up,
Yes.
um, different princes sprouting from him, and so Abraham being the father of many nations is actually a little bit of a tell of this is the way in which you messed up.
Yeah. Yeah. If he was father of a few less nations, it would have been better. um. Um. Okay. So actual circumcision. Okay. So it's to me it's interesting, and I don't fully have my ideas processed or thought out about okay why is God making um making circumcision a condition of the covenant, right? And fundamentally, I think it's related to some of the stuff that I just talked about that um, being circumcised um, isn't really it. I'm gonna keep using Protestant terms here, um, but like isn't really a work in the way that we think about works, right? The way that we think about works, we think about them as like doing good actions, right? And really being circumcised isn't one of those. It's closer to um like being baptized, right? Like when you're baptized, you're not being baptized for somebody. Like you're not doing anything for another person. It's an identity marker, right? It's a thing that connects you to that community, right? And that's what being circumcised does. It is uh it's a thing that you do in your innermost like being, in your most like personal part, most personal part of your physical being, and um it also like it shows quote unquote like who you truly are, right? And so in some ways it is kind of connected with um I'm going to use a term that that Paul Vanderklay uses, which is the secret sacred self, um, which is like the you that is inside of you that only you know of, that other people don't really have access to, and Paul Vanderklay's idea is that this is more of a modern concept, but I think that there actually is something that kind of links here with the idea of circumcision and what circumcision is and means. Um, and by being this, um, you can, but also can't hide who you are, right? Because like obviously like since it's it's your private parts, they are private, right? And so like you're not necessarily displaying them out in front of everybody unless you're a part of of actual Roman culture and doing the whole Roman bath thing. um but I think in most contexts, most people aren't going to necessarily know whether you are or are not circumcised. I would think um, that's one of the areas where I feel like I need to do a little bit more research on, because it's not something that anyone talks about too often. Um, um, but what? Okay, but what is circumcision? Okay, so I think fundamentally to know what circumcision is, right? I think is in this verse, right? So it says, "Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." So, um, a lot of times, whenever you, well, so I'll just say, so if you just look up, like, what does the Bible mean whenever it says like to be cut off? It will say things like, it means to be excommunicated, um, to be like removed from the community. And really fundamentally, I, I don't think it means that. It kind of does in practice, but fundamentally, what it means to be cut off it means that you won't have a family anymore. Um, which is why when we go later in Genesis and elsewhere, if you read about levirate marriage, it will say that part of the reason why you should do levirate marriage, and levirate marriage should be an action that takes place, is so that the person who died won't be cut off. Um, and so levirate marriage is a system to establish that family line. And so, really, what it means to be cut off is that you lose the family line. And if we think about like how circumcision works, I think that this makes total sense, right? Because, and again, this is one of those instances of this doesn't need to be a like active thing. It doesn't need to be a thing where Abraham's descendants are going around and being like, "Hey, are you circumcised? Are you not circumcised?" And then they choose who they excommunicate and who they hang out with. Because like if you're a member of this community and you choose to not be circumcised, essentially what you're doing is you've lost the identifier that you are actually a part of the community, right? And so after enough time, you've just like either you or your descendants, right? If you're not getting your kids circumcised, what you're doing is you are separating yourself from the line of Abraham. And so because you're doing that, well, you're cut off. You're no longer a part of that line, right? And so a lot of this comes together just naturally and isn't and to me isn't necessarily a thing that um that has to be done actively. Now, furthermore, what is it? Um, I've talked about this before, and I'm gonna say it again here. So, circumcision is you cutting off a part of uh, the thing that fundamentally generates more life, more children. You're cutting off a small portion of it in order to preserve and make sure that you are not cut off from your whole family line, right? And so what this is a this is similar to um the garments of skin, and it's similar to um what Jesus does on the cross, right? What Jesus does on the cross is he uses death to defeat death, right? The the um, the garments of skin are utilizing death in a way to stave off death, and circumcision is you are um, uh, cutting off some of the thing that generates a family so that you can not be cut off from the family that you generated, right? Um, and so that's how these things and these concepts work together, and it it shows. So this is the way. This is my argument for the way in which having circumcision be a sign of the covenant is going to be one of the things that um, preserves uh, the Hebrew identity until and actually after Christ, right? And so that becomes the thing. That's so now we can do the thing where I said you can spiritualize it, right? And so now you can understand that the circumcision of the heart is supposed to be about an identification with uh with the family of Abraham, right? And we do that by um by accepting Christ and what he did and all of that stuff. Um any comments or anything about anything that I have said? Um well, and actually this kind of stinks because I thought Christian was going to be here and he said that he was going to ask stuff. Um
Um, so in looking at this and comparing this covenant with the later uh like passing down of the law, um, do you think that the kind of lax nature of this covenant into the more strict nature of the other represents like an inherent scaling problem, or in more like Pagelian terms, like when you have a kind of unity moving into a larger multiplicity that has various other spirits or influences or behavioral postures, whatever you want to say, that now what was once capable of being like inferred now needs to be like enumerated. Um, that that the walk before me and be blameless kind of comes from the fact that it is just one one line, one family with a little tighter structure versus, you know, all the influences that are going to come in from they're not really well following the idea of not mixing cultures. Um,
Yeah. Um, I don't know fully because the thing is that in some ways this walk before me and be blameless, and I didn't mention this, but it is also similar to what Jesus said, right? Of be perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect, right? And so in some ways Jesus is doing a little bit of a simplification, right? He's doing a simplification of the law, right? And toning it down and going it back to something like this, but arguably in a transcultural context, and so is going to be exposed to even more influences, and there's going to be even more um there's going to be more Christians than there were Israelites, right? And there's going to be a larger variety of them than there were Israelites, uh, and especially as it goes on, right? Into now, we have even more variations on Christians than there pretty much have ever been of
yeah,
Jews and Israelites. Um, and so in some ways, yes, that's what's going on because, I mean, in like it's pretty clear to me that the law is trying to be like, okay, this is how you get a this is how you get a nation to um like, or these are the stipulations upon which a nation in that relative context should be oriented towards God, and um like it is by these very strict um rules, and I think those very strict rules are there to show something about God's nature. Um but yeah, so I guess that's just something that I would need to think about more because there are ways in which you could see what Christ is doing is like I just said is like an amplification of that, but it's also a simplification, and I guess maybe that what this would be where I would argue that Christians shouldn't be like, and I forget what that one pastor's name was, quote unquote, unhitching themselves from the Old
Mhm.
Testament, right? And what we're supposed to be doing is we're supposed to be, I think what we're supposed to be doing is think we're supposed to be reading the law and figuring out how the law applies in our cultural context. Um, and then that would be us following like Sinai to a certain degree. From this pattern with this being like um being more akin to what Jesus is doing. Um, but of course, most people don't want to do that. Which is a little bit funny actually, considering where we were just at with the conference and everything. Um,
Yeah.
being that like arguably some of the groups that are closer to doing more Sinai type stuff are like the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, right? They're the ones with the rituals and the architecture and the liturgy and all of this stuff. Um, and at the same time, they're going, we don't follow the Old Testament in any capacity. It's like, do you? Do you? um, but at the same time, I'm arguing that I think that's actually somewhat of a good thing, is because I think that if we got the right, and I sort of take that to me, right. This is sort of what I think the Bible means by like Jesus fulfilled the law, right? It doesn't say Jesus like it doesn't say like that like everything about it is done and like that there's nothing to like glean from it. Um, although that is how people take some of the verses in uh in Hebrew in the book of Hebrews. Um, but I'm not arguing that here. Um,
Yeah, I would say that arguably, I mean, what I was thinking of when I was thinking of that question is that if you have like a group that like gets together at a certain time regularly and they're small enough and they have certain behaviors that are consistent enough through them, and ways in which they interact with each other, it's going to be understood amongst that group, like after a period of time, how it is that they're meant to behave. But as you increase the scale of that group,
it breaks
um,
down. Yeah, this is the
it
fandom
breaks down to the point
the problem.
where the things that were implicit now need to become explicit.
Yes.
Um, and now you need policies and codes of conduct, and
HR
like
departments.
and barriers to entry and all that sort of thing. And I suppose the unity that we see in like the earlier section of the or at least with this first covenant is kind of what is fulfilled by Christ, in a sense what you could say that Christ is fulfilling is that he's showing up to be the top of the hierarchy, to preserve it on an individual scale, like to enumerate the spirit of the law like to every person, which is what they mean by like circumcision of the heart, have the word
Right. That
in your heart.
and like
That's
that's where people, it's like the law is written on their hearts, right? I think that's
yeah.
part of like, I think that's like supposed to be a part of like the circumcision of the heart. I think that's all like related. It's about like the spiritual identity is like stored like inside of you. Um, which is also like that, like it's stored like in like the like because like your body is like a temple, right?
Yeah.
And so like you become like the embodiment of the religion, of the faith, pretty much. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, I mean, like, I think that is what you just said, right? And so, like what you said is like it's the difference of a family owned mom and pop and a Fortune 500 company, right? They need HR departments, right? Whereas the mom and pop doesn't, right?
Mhm.
Um, and um, and in some ways, I think my argument is that um, so it's a little bit like so right, so like Nate, whenever he went out to Seattle, um, right, like he was going to like the mega church out there, and then during COVID,
Mhm.
the mega church pastor was like, "Oh, I think that this is like I think that the future is like home churches, right? And house churches, and so we're gonna switch over to being a network of house churches. Um, and in some ways, I think that's like right, and I think in some ways you could kind of think of what Jesus is doing is actually a little bit like that, right? It's a little bit like um, we're gonna go back to rather than this centralized method, we're gonna go back to this decentralized method. Um, But as far as I can tell, largely, that didn't work. um, uh, for like his network of house churches, and so a smaller megachurch just ended up forming in the old building, and then I think they like went to a different building or something, and they ended up being a part of that. Um, but I think in some ways that that example is a little bit indicative of how I do think that Jesus was trying to. This is sort of one of my arguments uh, against like Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. Is they'll be like, this is how the early church did it, and it's like, and then they'll be like, oh yeah, and see actually, and like, so like, I don't know if you've seen like some of the videos of like Ben Shapiro talking to Michael Knowles, and Ben's like, actually, if I were to become Christian, I'd probably become Catholic, and his reason for that is because all of the rituals that are in Catholicism to him are actually very similar to all of the rituals that are in
Yeah.
Judaism. And it's funny to me because the Catholics will then turn around and be like, "See, this is why we're right." And and it's like, well, actually, like if you read like the New Testament, like a lot of that like superficial ritualizing was the thing that Jesus was kind of going against. And so actually
Yeah.
this is like kind of like this is actually kind of ammo for a lot of the Protestants to be like, oh, see, actually we're right. We do know that you're being too much like Pharisees, right? Um, and to like complete this circle for what I'm trying to argue is that I think that Protestants need to tone that tendency down a little bit and realize that um, there's a relationship between centralization and decentralization that happens throughout the scriptures, and I think that needs to happen um, with uh, with Christianity, um, which is ironic considering that we go to a non-denominational church. um, but I think that uh, one of the I think that one of the eventual results of the internet will actually be an increase in uh, ecumenical tendencies and getting closer to something like a mere Christianity. And so, what we'll end up seeing is that the internet, which is fundamentally a decentralization platform, will actually bring about um, a unity of what the identity of what it means to be a Christian, right? Um, and this is, I mean, even on like Twitter, like recently, like people were having the age-old argument about whether or not Mormons are Christians, kind of a thing. And more, I feel like I'm seeing Christians being like, well, you guys aren't because you don't meet this like definition of what a Christian is, and I don't think that you would have had that even like 30 or 40 years ago. I don't think you would have had like Presbyterians and Baptists and all of these other different groups being able to be like, oh yeah, we can kind of agree on what the base mirror Christianity is. Uh, and I think a lot of that is coming through um, increase in apologetics studies, right? An increase of like what I would argue is a part of like sanctification process. Um, and so that's why I think there's so. Uh, I mean, I I hope this is clear that I'm trying to balance and demonstrate what I mean by layered covenants and um, layered sets of rules and how I think they work together, and you're not supposed to just think that like one set is better than the other. Like I don't think you're supposed to just think that the simpler set is better, and I don't think that you're supposed to just think that the more complicated set is better. I think you're supposed to see that they both have different functions. You're supposed to see that they have trade-offs. Um,
All right, it's time for me to go.
all right, later. Good luck with your game. Do you have anything, Diego? Are you even there?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I was looking in the fridge when you asked,
Oh no.
and I just learned that there was no more Asiago cheese. I was devastated.
Oh, you're having a rough day.
But I like your take there on the internet. That was an interesting point that I realized I agreed with after a couple minutes.
Oh, good.
That's my input.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, we'll end it there. Um, I'll blame Christian for this not being a longer one. But see you next time.